It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this first event in the spring series of our Russia Public Policy series event. This is something that we run in close coordination with NYU's Jordan Center. Today's first event is entitled Remaking the Social Contract, Pension Reform and Protest in Russia. Before I introduce the panelists, and just talk a little bit about the ground rules, I want to just give the microphone to my colleague, Josh Tucker from NYU, who'll let you know a little bit about the Jordan Center and also about some upcoming highlights that we have this spring.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you all for coming out today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I wanted to take this opportunity to welcome you as well. I'm Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, and this is a series. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about the New York City Russia Public Policy series that we've been running jointly with the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center. So this has been going on now for a couple of years. And the idea is that, that all of our research institutes, we spend a lot of time focusing on research, which is a lot of academic work that's being done to sort of further the study and understanding of Russia. But we wanted to sort of come together to try to put on some events that would talk more about public policy issues. And we've been doing this with high-profile panels, bringing together a number of different scholars, sometimes pairing with journalists as well, and for the New York City area to have a sort of regular discussion of Russia public policy issues around here. And it's been wonderful working together and having this jointly with Harriman and the Jordan Center. And I just wanted to highlight, as Alex said, this is the first event of the spring, but we've got a chock-full schedule for the New York City Russia Public Policy Series this spring. This is going to be the first event, and 2 weeks from today, on February 7th, at the Jordan Center, we're going to have the second event, so it's a quick turnaround. But the event is going to be on what we've learned about the Russian troll accounts on Twitter. So for some of you who may know this, Twitter released about 10 million tweets that were attributed to these 3,500 Russian troll accounts. And there have been various academic scholarly teams working on analyzing this. And we're going to, the best knowledge for the first time, bring a bunch of them together. So we're going to have people from the University of Washington, from Clemson University, and from my lab, the Social Media and Political Participation, or SMAP lab at NYU. And we're going to get a panel of a number of people who are working on this. And we're going to talk about what everybody's learned. And we're going to bring these groups together to talk about what we've learned about the actual behavior of the trolls on Twitter in the 2016 election campaign. And I just want to let you know as well to mark your calendars for Thursday, April 18th. I know it's quite a bit far away, but the Steve Cohen-Mike McFaul debate was such a hit last year that we're going to bring Steve back to talk about his book this time.
That's right.
And we're not going to drag Mike all the way back out from California, but very fortunately we're going to have Jack Snyder from Columbia, so we'll have a talk about Steve's new book that will also be down at NYU on April 18th, and there'll be other events as well. But anyway, thank you so much. Welcome, Kristy. I'm so sorry what happened, but it's so great to have you here by Skype. We're really glad you can join us, and I'm really looking forward to the panel tonight. I'm going to turn it back over to Alex. So
Perfect.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. So I won't give too much background presentation on this, except to say that this is really the idea, and the driving force behind this is Yana's Gorkovskaya, who's our distinguished postdoctoral fellow who teaches courses on domestic Russian politics and in general has been just a wonderful addition to our Harriman community. And the idea behind this is to bring together a historian, a political scientist, and an analyst to each bring their perspectives on what I think caught some observers, certain commentators here in the U.S. By surprise as to why we would have protest over this. But of course, Yana was quick to point out that there's a real history to movements in responses, and especially on the pension issue itself. So let's dig much deeper than some of the kind of superficial commentary that we get. And so what we're going to do is go in the order of the programming. Kristy will go first via Skype, so we'll move so we're able to see her. And then our next panelist, Kristy Ironside, who's an assistant professor of history and classical studies at McGill. Then Katerina Tertytchnaya, who's a lecturer in comparative politics, and she's come all the way from University College in London and is actually teaching tomorrow, so we're really grateful that she's joining us. And then Andrei Kolesnikov, who's the senior fellow and chair of the Russian Domestic Politics Political Institutions Program at the Carnegie Moscow Center. A couple more reminders. We are being taped and live streamed, so I remind everyone this is an on-the-record discussion and will be publicized and archived and all the things that happen online now. And I'll ask each speaker to limit their remarks to about 20 minutes, and I'll give you maybe a 5-minute warning beforehand. So without further ado, welcome everyone, welcome in the audience. Kristy, take it away.
Two squares at the bottom.
What's going on? We had this working before. Okay, there we go. How about now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. Thank you. I wanted to just start off by saying thank you very much to Jana for inviting me and to the Harriman Center and the Jordan Center, and to apologize for not making it in person. I really did try. I tried yesterday and again today, but we got something like 15 centimeters of snow and then rain, and it went from minus 15 Celsius to +4 today, so it's pretty treacherous in Montreal. So before I start talking about what I want to talk about today, which is the 1956 pension law, which was really the basis of Soviet pension law in the late Soviet period, what I wanted to do was just say a little bit where this comes from, why I'm at all interested in this topic, because in fact, the book that I've been working on, that I've written, it's not actually about pensions. It's about money and prosperity, the idea of prosperity in the post-war Soviet Union. And so I came to pensions through this issue of prosperity. You know, being able to offer state pensions to the vast majority of people was really linked to this idea of the Soviet Union's growing prosperity as it moved away from the war's damage and moved toward the state of abundance that they thought was necessary for full communism to be achieved. So I'm going to talk about the development of this law in 1956, which really did form the basis of pension policy until the Soviet Union collapsed. There were attempts in the Gorbachev years under Perestroika to try to reform this, but all of those didn't really go anywhere. Those attempts didn't go anywhere before the Soviet Union collapsed. So in some ways, this 1956 model was kind of the model that post-Soviet reformers had to contend with in Russia. And I would contend, from my perspective as a historian, I would contend that one of the reasons that it's proved so difficult of late to reform pensions is that this idea of pensions being a part of the social contract, you know, this is in some ways one of the big achievements of the Soviet Union. In fact, one of the major achievements of the late Soviet period, when people still enjoyed it, well, when people had a relatively higher level of stability and material comfort. And this is the period that when you look at these polls talking about how, you know, there's some nostalgia for the Soviet Union, this is typically the period that people are referring to the Brezhnev years in particular. So with these policies that were enacted in the Khrushchev years, but really came to fruition in the Brezhnev years. Before I go into how this came about, I should also mention that the word pension in Russian kind of carries more connotations, I think, than it does in English. The term refers very expansively to a lot of different payments that people would have received from the state. So, you know, the old age pension, you have a breadwinner pension if you were the survivor of somebody who had died, for your children. I'm going to focus on the old age pensions, but I just want to point out that the word applies rather broadly to other types of benefits. I think sometimes when we think about the Soviet Union, we think about socialism, we assume that pensions were a given in this context, but this was not actually the case. So the Bolsheviks come to power in 1917, promising pensions, promising all kinds of other social welfare guarantees, but it's not actually for another 10 years that they're able to develop the resources to start paying them. So they're really a Stalinist innovation in their first incarnations. So the first pensions go to textile workers in 1927, and then they start to roll out old age pensions to other industries over the course of the first 5-year plan. This system evolves after this in a very piecemeal fashion. So it's not until 1956, this law I'm going to talk about, that you actually have one law that refers to most categories of workers, most categories of old age pensioners. Before this, it really depended on your industry, your line of work. There were all kinds of different pieces of legislation that governed this. You did have some policies that set some kind of central regulations for these decentralized pension policies. One of them was the law that was enacted in 1930 that sets the minimum retirement ages. Now, these are the retirement ages that were in effect until this past summer. So this set the minimum retirement age at 60 for men and 55 for women, and they could retire if they had achieved what they referred to as the stage, the labor period, as we can translate it in English. So men needed a labor period of no less than 25 years, and women needed 20 years. This also, about 2 years later, this was complemented by another law that capped the kinds of pensions that you could receive, the amounts of pensions that you could receive, at a percentage of a 300 ruble wage amount. So what this meant was, in the 1930s, maybe this was a pretty generous pension, but it certainly would not be later on, especially after the war. What this meant was that if you were lucky enough, you got 100% of your former wages up to a 300 ruble amount. If you only got 50, you might get a pension of 150 rubles, something like this. So the people who worked in the most important industries, things like coal, metallurgy, etc., they would get all kinds of exceptions that let them retire with 100% of their previous wages, or up to this 300 ruble cap that let them retire earlier. But for most other people, up until 1956, they got a percentage of a maximum pension amount of 300 rubles. Lots of people, I should point out, were not at all covered by Soviet pension policy prior to 1956, and also beyond that. So collective farmers were not entitled to receive a pension until 1964, and lots of people who had not achieved these labor periods. So if you had not put in enough time in the workforce, you would not get a pension at the end of the day. So it was not a comprehensive system by design. And one of the reasons that it wasn't a comprehensive system was because the Soviet government, the Stalinist government, really understood all of this. They understood their pension policy as a tool in the struggle for labor discipline and productivity. So pensions very much get wrapped up in this interwar attempt to try to curtail labor turnover, to get people to stay in one job, to work in that job until they reach retirement age. And so they very much link it to this in the 1930s. In fact, in 1938, when they have a new decree on labor discipline, the government rails against, I quote, the job hoppers, slackers, shirkers, and grabbers who strive to give the government less work and snatch more money for themselves when it comes to pensions. So there's a real sense in the Stalin period, in the interwar period, that people were just working long enough to get a pension and then were kind of going off to another job. They weren't sticking around. So they really turn to pensions as a kind of disciplinary technique vis-a-vis the working class. They want them to work toward a pension at the end of the day, and this is an incentive to stay in your job. The thing that really creates a much more coherent and a much more sort of centralized sort of set of regulations about pensions in the Stalin era is the Second World War. So it's during the Second World War that millions of people become able to claim a pension on the basis of their military service or on the basis of a family member's military service, so a deceased husband, in some cases parents as well. And again, the government turns to pensions as a kind of incentive. So they say, while you are off at the front, do not worry, we've got your back. At the end of the day, if you are not able to work until you're old enough to claim an old age pension, you will get a generous, what they call an invalid pension, and that will make sure that you and your family are able to survive. But of course, in reality, getting these pensions was rather difficult. You had to keep on proving that you were unable to work. The standards for claiming a war invalid pension, in fact, were no different than the ones that were in place for claiming a labor invalid pension. So it was all around your ability to work or not work. And you had to keep on confirming that you had, lost an arm, you had an arm amputated or something like this. It was a kind of a humiliating process for most people trying to claim these pensions. In the meantime, so while they create these pensions, they're offering more pensions to people who had participated in the Second World War, and these were rather low. I should point out that some of them were actually, because they were not pegged to any kind of cost of living, they were very much pegged to what you had earned before the war, or if you had never had a job, if you'd been a collective farmer, you weren't paid money, or if you had gone straight from high school to go fight off on the front, many people just got what were effectively symbolic amounts, very low, not at all anywhere near what you would earn in industrial wages. So they really kept those pensions very low, in part because they wanted people to not dwell on what had happened during the war. It was still very much linked to labor discipline, about getting people to be productive, to put in whatever labor they had left in them into rebuilding the country and moving forward. While they're doing this, though, while they're keeping those pensions very low, the Stalinist government keeps on offering all kinds of privileged pensions to people who are in coal and metallurgy, as well as to what are known as personal pensioners. So these are people who received their pension not because they were a worker or because they'd put in any kind of labor, but because they had done something extraordinary on behalf of the revolution, on behalf of the state. And with them, they have certain caps that are in place for how much they can get in a pension, but they also have all kinds of material privileges. So they can go and petition for better housing, things like this. So lots of kinds of privileges proliferate in the late 1940s, while lots of people are really struggling to get by on pensions that had become not nearly enough to live on. The interesting thing is the government was well aware of this. Well, I was very surprised when I was digging around in the archives about all of this, because I had assumed that this was very much a 1956, 20th Party Congress thing. But in fact, actually, the government was aware of the problem and began trying to reform the problem of pensions, the fact that they were low, the fact that there was this very decentralized set of laws, that there are all kinds of contradictions in pension policy. And so they start trying to reform this as early as 1949, so very much during Stalin's lifetime. But the truth is that he actually took no part in it whatsoever. He was not at all interested in this. He kind of confirms the model that Yoram Gorlitsky and Oleg Khavnyuk have proposed for the post-war period, in which basically Stalin is focused on foreign affairs, things like this, domestic reforms. He's not all that interested in those things, and he kind of delegates authority. And so he delegates authority for coming up with a new pension law to, essentially, it's the Council of Ministers of the RSFSR who takes the lead with this, and they put together a commission of people, including the Minister of Finance, Arseniy Zverev, who is, the fact that he's on this committee, I think, says something about the economic priorities involved in this, but also people from the trade unions, also people from the Ministry of Social Security. And so there's this commission that gets put together to try to figure out how to, what they call, unify pension policy. Then we're going to take all these different laws that apply to different industries and put them under a single set of legislation and figure out a way to raise pension amounts while still preserving labor incentives, while still making it, imperative in people's minds that they need to work as much as possible and go on a pension at the end of their working life as their reward for that labor, but they still want to stay in the workplace. And really, they go through about 7 or 8 different incarnations of trying to figure out how to do this. And in each instance, they reject the pension policy that they come up with. It's either found to be, not respecting certain industries' specific needs, or it's not, the incentive value is not good enough, or it's just simply too costly because no new money is devoted toward this initiative in this time period. And in the meantime, the other really interesting thing that's happening is that pensions, the inadequacy of pensions, is starting to become an issue that people actually mobilize around in the post-war period. If you look in the Russian state archives, there are dossiers after dossiers of people writing in letters complaining about their pensions, petitioning for higher pensions, and sometimes this works. You might get your pension bumped up a little bit if your letter made it to the right person. But a lot of people increasingly referred to this pension policy, this decentralized approach to this, and the inadequacy of their pensions as a major moral failing of the Soviet regime. Just to give you some sense of this. So, for example, when Invalid of Labor wrote to the government in 1949 that this approach to pensions had divided pensioners into, quote, beloved sons and neglected stepchildren. So the ones that they care the most about get good pensions, everybody else they don't particularly care about. After Stalin dies, these letters start to become a lot more frequent. They start to become a lot more blunt in their criticism. So you have people who are writing in all the time saying things like, I quote, "When we are young, we are all assured that in our difficult moments in old age, we will not be forgotten about and we will be guaranteed a minimum standard of living. But this is not so. We are supposed to live on 210 rubles a month and envy those who get 50% of their wages, even though many of us are of more use to the government than those who receive higher pensions." So there's a real sense that many of these elite pensioners were getting these high pensions, for naught, while ordinary people were starving, were not able to make ends meet on their pensions. So pension policy becomes a real kind of political football in some ways. I was sort of struggling with the metaphor, but I ended up with political football. In the post-Stalinist leadership struggle, there's this great awareness that they need to do something about this. And so Malenkov actually starts to write a new pension policy himself. He works on this between 1953 and 1955. And he comes up with a new model for financing this because, again, the government is very resistant to the idea of putting any new money into financing a new pension reform. And so Malenkov's sort of primary reform that he wants to do is he wants to shift the way that pensions are financed. He wants to shift it, at least in part, onto workers themselves. So the draft law that he comes up with, it proposes that every month, 1% of a worker's wages would be deducted toward a, quote, personal savings fund, so liczny fonda sberежения, which would be separate from the amount of money that enterprises paid into toward workers' pensions. The state would then match 1/10 of what the worker contributed toward his own pension. This proposal was completely rejected. It's not clear why, but it seems to have been a bit of a casualty in the conflict between Khrushchev and Malenkov over who was going to become the new leader. Because basically Khrushchev, he declares that this idea of having workers pay into their own pensions, this is impermissible, I quote. There's no way we can do this. And I would say this is partly because Khrushchev really positioned himself against Malenkov as the defender of the everyman's interests. And how could we ask people to pay into their own pensions? Your pension should be something that you get from the state as the reward for your lifetime of productive labor and contributions towards socialism. So this idea gets quashed. And it will never get brought up again until we get to perestroika, when Gorbachev actually goes back to some of these ideas and says, we need to have people invest into their own pensions. So as Khrushchev comes to power in 1955, 1956, he positions himself as someone who's going to sort of defend the everyman, including the everyman pensioner. He's going to defend their interests. And so as he prepares toward the 20th Party Congress, and then at the 20th Party Congress, he openly criticizes this pension system and says that we are going to have a new pension system within a year. This is something that I'm going to do. So actually at the 20th Party Congress, and we always think about this Congress for the secret speech when he criticizes Stalin, but in fact, the bulk of what he talked about was economic things in this speech. And he talks about how we're going to more fully meet the people's material needs, things like this. And he says we are going to fix the serious deficits in our pension policy. And so within just a few months of this, by May of 1956, the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party votes to support a new pension law. And in what is almost certainly a symbolic gesture to war veterans, they publish this law in the newspapers on May 9th, 1956, so on Victory Day, anniversary of Victory Day. And they ask people to send in their suggestions for how to improve it before they finalize the law. So basically, to sum up, this is an incredibly complex document. There's lots of different moving parts in it. But to sum up what it's going to do differently compared to all of these other pension policies that were in place, the idea is that they're going to harmonize all of the existing legislation under one set of laws, right? So there's going to be some exceptions, things like this. But all of the people who are receiving pensions as war veterans, old age pensioners, breadwinner pensioners, things like this, they are all going to be under a single set of legislation, and they're going to raise the amounts across the board that everybody receives. The other thing that this law confirms is that it's in the very preamble, in the very first paragraph, they say, we are never going to ask workers to pay for their own pensions. This is kind of a very clear allusion back to that internal discussion about having people invest in their own pensions. Some other things that the law proposes to do is it's going to get rid of that 300 ruble cap for calculating pension amount. So now it's not going to be that you get a sort of an artificial cap on what you can count toward it. It sets new maximum pension amounts. It also sets new minimums. And it also confirms that the government is not going to change the pension age. So it actually keeps the pension age that had been around since 1930. So that is preserved by this. It also builds in a new.
Can I just give about a 5-minute warning here?
I've got 2 more pages and I'm done.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm coming to the end. So the other thing that it does is it builds in a series of bonuses for people who work beyond pension age. So if you go beyond, you work, you can still get a portion of your pension and you get certain bonuses. And the publication of this, it really sets off a public discussion. So they ask people, this is the first time since the 1936 Constitution that they ask people for their input into a law that the Soviet government is thinking about putting in place. And people write in thousands of letters. They write in saying, we need to do more for disabled people. We need to do more for old age pensioners. We need to make the pension age even lower. And this is not actually a publicity stunt. In fact, they actually put together a special commission. They assess all of the suggestions. And in the end, they do take some of them. And in part, this is, it is a publicity stunt in the sense that, they say we're being very responsive to all of this, but they actually do take some of these suggestions quite seriously. And so one of the things that they do is they scrap this clause that had been in place that tied war invalids who had never had a job, who had gone straight to the front from school, that said if you don't have a pre-injury earning, you can only get the set amount. They scrap that and give them higher pension amounts. So the law is enormously popular, and it is announced to great fanfare on October 1st, 1956, and its impact is felt almost immediately. So just to give you a sense of the numbers, and I'll end really quickly after that. So it narrows the wide divergence in amount that people had received. It makes everybody more aware of what you need to do to get a pension. It sort of simplifies the procedures, and it increases the number of pensioners. So prior to October 1st, 1956, you have about 1.95 billion rubles are being paid in pensions. This rises to 3.5 billion rubles overnight. And the average pension rises from 149 rubles to 271 rubles across the Soviet Union. So rather substantial differences. And so I would argue that this law, in some ways, it achieved many of the things. One of the reasons it was so popular is that it achieved many of the things the Soviet regime had long been promising it was going to do for people. It eliminated inequalities. It made life easier for the socioeconomically vulnerable. It rewarded people's honest labor to the state. And it was very much bound up in this moral victory of World War II and the Soviet Union's achievements in the context of the Cold War. At the same time, though, it created a lot of problems for the late Soviet state that would continue to reverberate. So rather than examining the state's prerequisites for receiving its care, for receiving welfare benefits, it simply narrowed the divergence between amounts received. So it wasn't like we're going to rethink the way we think about disabled people and how we can help them. The fundamental concern was still about labor and still about productivity. It also completely upended economic planners' calculations about how much money to introduce into the economy. So basically, a tidal wave of cash hits the economy after this law goes into place, which is money that cannot be adequately spent on consumer goods. So this has ripple effects for real wages, just across the board for pensioners and for workers. And finally, it also has a really big impact upon productivity, because now more people than ever before can leave and go off on a pension. So already by 1964, the government backtracks a little bit on this and pushes people back to work. So the Brezhnev government essentially leaves this pension policy in place. They tinker a little bit with it, but for the most part, this is the system that is in place in the late Soviet period. As I said, Gorbachev tries to change this, but doesn't succeed before the Soviet Union collapses. He also tries to renege on that provision that the government would never ask people to pay into their own pensions to no avail. And so I would argue, I'm sort of giving this panoramic view of pension policy. I would argue that one of the reasons that a lot of people, have great nostalgia for this is that this was sort of, this is associated with this period of great stability in their lives in the Soviet Union that some people still have kind of fond feelings about, and that actually pension policy was a rather hard-won victory in the Soviet context. It wasn't a given. It wasn't something that just sort of came with the revolution, but it really was an achievement of the late Soviet period in particular. And so this promise of financial stability underwritten by a state pension that's a reward for your lifetime of labor and your service to the Soviet state and Soviet society, this was really one of the inviolable guarantees of the late Soviet system, at least on paper. And it's one that many people look back fondly on, and many younger people in Russian society today are quite convinced they will never live to see in their own lifetimes. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Kristy, thank you so much. And you projected really clearly. Your visuals were terrific. It was just like you were in the room here. So thank you for that. And plus the superb overview and primer of sort of Soviet era policies and inputs and dilemmas. So everyone has a PowerPoint, right? So ask maybe next on our list, Katya, to present hers.
I would like to start also by thanking everybody for the invitation to present here today. A special thanks to the Jordan Center, the Harriman, and of course Dr. Gorokhovskaya for the invitation to be here. In my talk today, I will try to place the pension reform protests in context, discussing a little bit how similar or how different they were from protests we saw in Russia before. And I will do so by sharing with you some newly released protest data from the Lankina protest event dataset and some findings from my own work that I have been doing over the years. Before I start, though, I should say that the last time I presented this data was exactly 2 years ago this very same building at the Harriman Institute. At the time, we were at a panel discussion with Dr. Gorokhovskaya, and the question for us then was precisely to understand how protest patterns, as we saw them in Russia, changed after the big electoral protests of 2011-2012. It was already striking at the moment that a lot has changed. There were some differences that stood out, and I can tell you already that these differences have become even more pronounced in the 2 years that have passed since that, January of 2017. But let's take things from the start, shall we? Now, okay, so this graph, as you can see, starts in July 2012 and ends in early 2017. So what was very interesting for us to see at the point, so what the graph shows you really is the percentage of socioeconomic protests that take place every month in Russia, and this is a percentage of every single protest that takes place across the country, right? So what was very interesting for us to see at the time was that within a very short period, so from 2012 to 2014, mid-2014, there was a twofold increase in the overall percentage of socioeconomic protest in Russia. Now, this percentage changed threefold by early 2017. So the socioeconomic protest made up 60% of all protests that took place in Russia. Now, you will say, why is this a paradox? Indeed, this was a period of very poor economic performance in Russia. And in my graph there, I have shaded months of negative growth in gray for us to be able to identify. But really, even the months that are not shaded, growth in Russia at this period was very low. And so the fact that people took to the streets to protest, the fact that people were upset about wage arrears, factories closing, wages going down, was really not a paradox at all. Political science will tell you that it would be paradoxical if people did not protest. The paradox that I write was different, and it's right here. The paradox was that despite socioeconomic unrest, despite growing economic hardship, presidential approval in Russia was quite high, and it made a jump just after Crimea's annexation. I have this line there for you to see, and you know, people will say, well, obviously this is a rally around the flag effect. There is nothing surprising, but rally around the flag effects do not normally last for 2 or 3 years in a row, as we have seen in Russia. And it was not the case that Russians did not feel the heat of the economic decline either. Now, we can discuss whether it was truly the economic sanctions or the decline in oil prices that affected the Russian economy, but the fact remained, people took the heat. What happened, though, is that they did not blame the country's president or the executive for their decline. Now, in political science, this is something truly fascinating, and it was very intriguing to see what exactly was happening at the time. Together with Professor Tamila Lankina at the London School of Economics, we did something that was truly very interesting and very informative. We went back to the data. All the data come from namarsh.ru. This is a liberal website. we went back to the data and using human coders, so not machine learning or anything, we started coding whom the protesters blame, where did the protest take place, what did slogans write when they were expressing socioeconomic grievances or otherwise. And what was really striking for us to see was that when people were protesting for wage arrears, for increases in tickets, for a reduction in their salaries, they were not blaming the federal government. They were blaming their employers. So this is, I can't point to that, but this is the second set of bars there. They were blaming their employers, the local authorities, that was indeed striking, and at a very smaller proportion, they were blaming the Russian state, the federal executive, for to be more precise. Political protests, on the other, that was a very different story. Political protests about freedoms, rights, etc., were clearly directed towards the federal executive. So I guess at that time, and remember, so this is 2 years ago, the question at everybody's minds was really if and when and why or how socioeconomic protests will change the targets of blame. So whether blame attribution in Russia will take a different form. And I think we can today safely say that this has happened. And in the intervening 2 years, things have indeed changed. So fast forward to today. So this graph contains data from up until December 2018. This is the last data point in the data set, and plots against the y-axis the total number of protests. So regardless of whether they're socioeconomic, political, etc., etc. And again, as before, in shaded gray, we have periods of negative growth, and bars are there for important events that I have labeled for us to see. Now, what we have seen is that protest numbers since 2017 have spiked twice. The first time was around the anti-corruption protests of spring 2017. And the second time was precisely when the pension reform was announced in the summer of last year. Yet these protests, the ones against corruption and the ones against the pension age reform, were quantitatively and qualitatively and substantively different. And now I want to take a minute and highlight 3 very important differences between the 2 sets of protests that we have here. So first of all, pension reform protests were much larger in size. This is not reflected in the graph there, that just plots the number of events, but we know that the most recent protests were able to attract far more people, and that the coalitions that were built, not necessarily amongst political parties, but if we look at the socioeconomic background of the protesters, were very different. Now, in the corruption protests of spring 2017, the liberal opposition, Alexei Navalny, had the lead. This was not necessarily the case last summer. We estimate that the Communist Party organized about 60% of these events, and some others placed this figure at around 70%. So I think this is, again, very, very important to note. And again, this is the very first time, going back to coding slogans and what people say, that we see slogans we would normally attribute to the anti-systemic, so the non-parliamentary opposition, being heard in the streets, in protests that were not organized by the Communist Party or by the Liberal Party. This was very important, and it was very striking for us to see. It was particularly interesting for political scientists who study this tension between elites and citizens, to see that some protesters were saying that, you know, at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin did choose to side with the elites. And he used to protect them from the hit of the economic sanctions. There was, an effort to protect the elites as opposed to the people. This is truly fascinating, and the fact that it was these views were aired in the streets, isn't it very, very interesting to see? Now, during this time, presidential approval that, again, I show here in this red line, also drops. I think, estimations and, conclusions should not be exaggerated. Presidential approval, according to the most recent Levada data, is around 66%. I came here from London. I can think of many leaders who would like to enjoy approval ratings of 66%, 70% right now. But it is quite striking for Russia in this context. I was looking at the data this morning just as a mode of comparison. I will tell you that in December 2011, when we had the huge opposition protest, electoral protest in Russia, Putin's approval was around 63%, 65% of the electorate. But at that time, it really jumped up quite quickly. This does not seem to be the case in this context, although it does seem to be stabilizing. And again, you see that downward trend of the blue line. I think it just is there to show you that, after the summer and after the reform was passed, people just, unrest slowed down a little bit. Now, responding to these trends and to this increase in protest activity across the streets of Russia, the Russian state has fought back. And it has done so in ways that showed learning, and I would even go as far as to say important sophistication. Now, I don't know if you can see what the graph says. I suspect that you can, because I'm very close and I still cannot see it. So this is a picture from Samara, right? And it was shared widely on social media, etc., etc. And it says, so dear citizens, the protest that is supposed to take place on December 3rd, 2017, from 4 to 8 o'clock on the Kirov Square in Samara has not been agreed upon, so it's unsanctioned. The invitation to participate in this protest is illegal, it's outside the law, and it constitutes a violation of social order, and it's signed by the administration of Samara. Now, this is very important. And it is very important because we know from experiments, we know from political science literature, behavior literature, that Russians are usually less likely to agree with the demands aired in violent protest. We also know that the quality, the nature of protest events, whether they're violent or peaceful, has a huge impact on whether people will say that they share the demands of the protesters or whether the protesters were right. But I'll come to that in a minute. I have another graph to show you. So what you see here, again, the data is from Namarsh.ru, but I'm not plotting protest here. So what I'm plotting here is the percentage of entries that make reference to either responsive repression, and what I call responsive repression is the imposition of fines against protesters, people being held or being led to the police after the protest, them facing imprisonment, or police moving violently against protesters, and the percentage of entries that make reference to preemptive repression, which is what I just showed you, right? So regional authorities denying permission to protest. The reason I look at percentage entries, and this we do, it's easy to do, so we have used text analysis, simple dictionary methods, produce very accurate results in this context. So preemptive repression, I have said what it means. So again, I don't know if that's working, but anyways, so I think for me there's two things that stand out, and I want to share them with you. So the first thing is right here. So around 2014, just after Crimea is annexed, we are observing an increase in what we call preemptive repression. So the state increasingly denies permissions to protest, and I think this is truly fascinating. And this is a finding we would not have had obtained if we were only looking at protest events. And the other thing that stands out is really the increase in responsive repression that accompanies the initiation of the pension reforms. Well, it started much earlier with the presidential election, but this is truly at levels unseen even for the 2011-2000 electoral protests. So we estimate that between December 2011 and May 2012, 1 in 3 protests would face some sort of disruption and violence. And this is going beyond that. Of course, you know, we can discuss about the quality of the data. This is only one data set. There is selection on what gets reported or not. There's ways around it. But you know, even if descriptively, I think these findings are again very interesting and have very important implications for how people, ordinary Russians, think about the protest and how they decide whether they themselves would be willing to engage in them or not. Okay. I understand that my time is coming to a close, so I wanted to end this on a more hopeful or a more positive note, other than repression. What we have seen in the recent in recent months and weeks, and we have Olena Nikolenko at the audience, and she will be able to tell a lot more about the geography of protest, is that compared to the 2011-2012 electoral protests, these protests are far more spread geographically. So here I have shaded in darker blue regions that experience greater unrest. So the darker the blue, the greater the unrest. And here you can see more areas being covered in darker shades. So there is geographic, so there is regional diversification, but within regions, there is also diversification in terms of where protests happen. Again, most recent data suggests that almost it's 50-50. So 50% of protests take place in urban centers, 50% take place in rural centers. And again, this is truly unprecedented. Now, you will say, why does it matter where protest events take place? And here, I just have a slide about some work, again, we have been doing with Professor Lankina, but also work that Professor Tim Fry has been doing with his collaborators. So in recent years, we have come more and more to understand that protests may not just influence public policy, but they may also influence how people think about the government, how people think about the opposition, and more broadly, whether they believe that political change at some point is likely or not. And we know that the 2011-2012 protests did have an impact on public opinion. What we also know, however, is that how people respond to the protests is greatly dependent on the nature of the protest events themselves. Remember, I already said it has to do with whether the events are violent or not, how the state responds, but also the message and the unity that the opposition is able to project. You know, in authoritarian regimes or electoral autocracies or liberal regimes, let's name it how we want, people don't have much information about the opposition. You don't hear about Navalny in the news. So such kind of messages that you see in the streets, that you see in your neighborhood, that you see around you, are very important for how people think and how people react. So I would like to say that although, you know, we have seen earlier the number of protest events has declined, I think it's still too early to decide what was their impact and what was their learning effects, not just in terms of the opposition, but also in terms of public opinion. But hopefully we will meet here again in 2 years' time, and that's a question we will take up then. Thank you very much for your attention and the invitation.
Now I'd like to invite Andrei to give his presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I was here a year ago talking about our research, mutual research with Levada Center about readiness for changes among people, average Russians, And I think we influenced the position of Kremlin in the end of the day, because Kremlin is talking all the time right now about changes and even breakthrough from something to something. This year we made another research about attitudes toward private property and private space. It was also very interesting, but today this is not the topic. Maybe I can contribute something to this discussion in a more broad sense, in a sense of new demands from the society and challenges and answers of authorities. This data from our research with Levada, it is August 2017. Does Russia need changes? It found out that Russia needs changes, and even decisive changes. It was the focus of attention of people. When we asked it about details, people didn't know what do they mean by changes. Is it equal to reforms? Is it equal to modernization? Give us a better life, simply. And this is the main goal of possible changes. If Stalin will contribute to it, it's quite okay. If Putin also, Kudrin, it's acceptable, but who's Kudrin? Nobody knows. There was a list of people who, we asked who are modernizers of Russia, who can deliver to changes. And the first place was such a person as Mr. Nobody, and 25% Putin. And then the list of politicians, which is well known in the electoral process. Kudrin Ellis has 1% with Kadyrov and something like this, paradoxical. So the same data 10 months ago, Levada Center repeated this question, and it was May 2018, after the presidential elections. So demand was growing for decisive changes. It's symptomatic. Despite the fact that it was a very huge mobilization of people around Putin during the presidential campaign. What was the answer of Putin to this demand? Increase in retirement age. This is not a proper instrument to answer to the demand. One step to the past. I think this is a description of the situation before the presidential elections, or before summer 2018. Very efficient negative mobilization around different ideas in the ideological sphere, around different ideas in the sphere of militarization of consciousness, anti-Western discourse, and so on and so forth. Nothing positive. But it was actionable, workable, and people consolidated around Putin as around the person who is suggesting negative agenda, negative proposals. What has happened in the middle of the summer, in the beginning of the summer? I name it great divergence in the image of Putin. He was, since 2014, he was a symbol of Russia, the flag to rally around. He wasn't a human being in that sense. He was a king. He was Tsar. It was a very comfortable position. But after this story with pension reform, after kind of a fatigue from him, after such a huge mobilization of presidential campaign of 2018, it found out that Putin is a living flesh. He is a human being. He shares responsibility with the government for the worsening of the situation. The social contract was very simple. Don't make something bad. We will support you in exchange for some social minimum, for feeding, for paternalistic action, something like that. But since the summer of 2018, we are witnessing the erosion of the social contract. And it was a mistake, in my opinion, for Putin, if we are talking in terms of political technology, to go to the screens and to talk with nations, just like Prime Minister or Minister of Finances explaining something. Tsarik could not explain anything. He is making decisions. He can say, so I will annul this reform or vice versa, but he can't explain details. This is not his role. It was noticeable that really all the ratings of Putin were falling down since July 2018, going to the new plateau, around 70, and right now really for 3 consequential months, October, November, December, 66%. This is also a description of explanation of what has been happened in this summer. The problem is that Putin really achieved the main goal. Russia became great again. Even in the year 2017, when we asked our respondents what are the priorities of possible changes, the well-known goals, just like more prosperous life, lesser inflation, quality of life, something like that, as the first places. The last place was under such a title as Great Power, 3%. Why is it so? We have achieved this goal. We are great. Nobody is against greatness. But here is a time to turn attention to something economic, social, and it was noticeable even 2 years ago. Right now there were results of a new survey of Levada Center, November date, it seems to me. This is a peak of the assessment of Russia as a great power, despite the fact that there are a lot of economic troubles and approval rating is falling down and trust rating is falling down, electoral rating is falling down. It means that this symbolic part of Putin's regime is still here, is still very important, but it is not a mobilizing force. It does not mobilize people around Putin. Neither military rhetorics, neither anti-Western discourse, nothing. And it is not proper tool to make Russia more and more great again and again. It's impossible. Putin has to pay more attention to economic issues. This is the end of old-fashioned mobilization. He's using this toolkit all the time, but I don't think that people in Kremlin are fools. They understand that they must change something in the agenda, in their proposals to the society, and they do that. This is simply some figures about this decrease of Putin's ratings, its approval rating in that case. You can see the turning point, July. So here is a new demand from below. What does this demand mean? Authorities can't decipher it properly. I would say that people don't know what do they want really. They want changes, abstract changes, uncertain changes, and I'm not agree with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who says all the time that we are witnessing left turn in the moods of Russians. This is not left turn. It is not red or white. It is not green or anything or rose. This is simply demand for something. We have seen it during the regional elections in September. People used such a tool as elections, not in order to get some goals, not in order to implement positive program. This is negative demand. This is simply the way, the instrument for demonstrating dissatisfaction, discontent. People can't change the situation using such a tool as elections, but they can demonstrate their discontent. We can name this demand populist, but this is not proper word. We can't properly name this phenomenon, and because of that we use this word populism, populist. At the same time, we can talk, in my opinion, about the appearance, the commencement of a new period in the history of Russian civil society. This is not about political protests. This is not even about labor protests, maybe. I mean the situation with primarily some steps from the top, just like in Moscow. Demolition of buildings, interventions into private spaces of people, and paradoxically, people who never thought about any political issues, they're going to the streets, to the squares, inside their backyards, in the framework of their private space. This is really new. I name it backyard sovereignty. People want to defend their private space, and they're ready to struggle. Struggle with bulldozers or anything. And this is not simply a private space, this is public space. They are ready to defend parks, they are ready to defend their backyards. This is really new, and this is fierce protest. This is really struggle with victims. And this is typical more to Moscow, to big cities with reconstruction processes. But we can pay attention, for instance, for protests against redistribution of garbage, of landfills, just like it was in Arkhangelsk Oblast, and this process will continue. It could be politicized, but this is not the goal of people to be politicized. Authorities could politicize people. This is another situation. Yes, really, authorities, Kremlin, I don't know, mayor's office, they can't decipher this new demands, but they can suggest their own agenda to people in order to avoid protests, to avoid new movements. Kremlin understands that here is a demand for changes, and they invent different instruments for it. Maybe you remember that in December, Putin convened State Council, and the topic of discussion was volunteer movement. Golikova, the social vice prime minister, said that here is new KPI. Everything is KPI'd in modern Russia. Every fifth person in Russia must be volunteer. It's kind of a substitution of state services, but at the same time, they want to involve people in their own ideas. They want to engage them. They want to find allies in a civil society. They want to buy civil society in order to make the agenda more socially biased, because they are talking about socially oriented organizations. And here is the new phenomenon in Moscow's metro. I've seen it myself twice or three times. Such a colored train with the title "Train of Changes." So if you are entering inside, you see an advertisement of different volunteer activities in different spheres, medical sphere, anywhere. So this is a way how to manage new demand. This is the understanding of a new demand. This is the instrument to rule this country, maybe. And this is the response of the authorities. Socially biased agenda, socially biased NGO. They are trying to use the same tools as a normal civil society. They are mirroring civil society. It's just like, you know, with some societies' initiatives, just like, for instance, Eternal Regiment. Right now, if you'll ask any person in the street who is an initiator of this Eternal Regiment, Besmertny Polk, people will say Putin for sure, because he's coming with the portrait of his father and he's leading this mob. But it was really a civil society initiative, and he nationalized it or privatized it. We can use different terms. And this is the same technology, I think. More broad context of it. Kudrin prepared a new program of modernization. They at the very top didn't use this program. They simply took some figures from it and implemented it in the form of increase of retirement age. I must say that Kudrin's experts prepared real pension reform, social reform, I would say, but only figures from this program were used. And right now, what is a substitution for changes? Authorities are not ready to change anything in political fundamentals, in political framework. They can't change state-oriented economy. They don't want to do it. And instead of it, they are suggesting a new program of digitalization of everything. This is a substitution of modernization. The second wave, so to say, it is technocratization. We're making research right now trying to understand the process of transition of elites during these years of possible upheavals, years before 2024. And the main direction is technocratization of the public administration. Well-educated, more young, distanced from financial groups, people who are working as vice governors, vice ministers, or ministers in regional governments, even as governors. All these new programs, Лидеры России, Leaders of Russia, Управленческий резерв, the reserve of public administration. Yeah, and all this stuff. The idea is not to touch political fundamentals, but change faces. For sure, it is not enough. You can't change the system using this tool. You can simply achieve such a small goal as digitalization, for instance. And one more feature: everything is state-centered, state-driven, and the idea is to get more money from people and return this money to the same people in order to buy their loyalty. And this is the logic of increase of VAT, value-added tax, and the logic of new tax for self-engaged people. Something like that. Here is the end of the story. So thank you for your attention.
So, three very interesting presentations and perspectives, and I just want to make sure, Kristy, are you still there?
I am.
Amazing, there you are. Okay, great. So let's go. I want to give the first question actually to Jana, who was also instrumental in the topic. And can I just ask, you wait for the mic to come and you just identify who you are for the record. So, Jana.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you all for a very interesting discussion. Kristy, thank you so much for setting the stage. And what I found really interesting, I didn't know the history, and I think most people don't know the history of the pensions, and I was really surprised that the age of retirement was set in 1930. It, I guess, explains why it's quite so young, and the expectation that people work 20 or 25 years. But I like this idea of the final 1956 law being sold as this, the government really taking care of you, right? This concept of zabota. And I think probably this is one of the reasons that, or one of the explanations for why people reacted so badly this time around, this violation of this zabota. And in light of what Katya and Andrei have told us about sort of social responses, I wonder, one of the things I was struck with in the pension reform is that Putin did take responsibility for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
He went on television, he explained that they were needed, and as Katya points out, excuse me, there's a tendency for the authorities to avoid blame for protests, and for the most part, or for kind of reforms that are unpopular. And for the most part, this has been successful, at least from what we see for Katya's data, that people don't actually blame the government, the federal government, for certain problems. They do if they're already politically oriented, but they don't if they're not politically oriented and they're protesting social or economic reform. So I wonder if you could just speak to, all three of you could speak to, there's obviously going to be other sort of poison pills that the Russian population is going to have to swallow in the next couple of years. And Andrei suggests that the move has been to sort of substitute modernization with this increasing digitalization. But is that going to be sufficient? And what does the fact that Putin stepped up and took responsibility for this reform tell us about the Kremlin's direction going forward in any other kind of socioeconomic reforms that will have to be made? And I assume they will have to be made.
Yeah, that's a great angle. Kristy, you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, Zabota is absolutely the word that is most associated with all of these pension reforms. And I mean, it was, again, like I want to stress that so much of this was seen as, you know, we have not been able to do these things that we've been promising we can do because we lack the resources, because, you know, we had the war, it interrupted our plans, but now we can give this great care. And so I think, like, partly there's some probably memories of that going on, but that's a very different type of approach to thinking about pensions than what we're used to. I mean, I'll be honest, you know, I'm like, yeah, I finally got like a permanent tenure track job and I'm thinking about a pension, right? And it's something you invest into. It's something that you're supposed to, you know, there's a completely different way of relating to your pension when it's something that's tied to markets, to investments, to, you know, like how much you contribute to it personally. That's not something that most people were familiar with, because all of that kind of went on behind the scenes, right? You were given your pension as a reward. And I think there are still some people, you know, again, I'm kind of generalizing it from a historian's perspective, but there are some people who are a little bit more sentimentally attached to that different model, the model of care. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks. Katya?
Yes, thank you very much. And I will focus on the blame avoidance piece, because this is what I do. So there's been terrific work showing how, you know, state-controlled media, especially when it comes to economic coverage, try to deflect responsibility and just not mention the president when economic performance is poor. Now, what I think has happened here is that there was really a dead end, and the only way that could have, you know, softened the blow at all was by the president to appear as this ecumenical figure who would be able to unite the crowds. We've seen Putin do this before. For example, the wildfires of 2010, he went to people who lost their homes, and he was that father figure, if you like, that was there to make things better. Now, in his address to the nation and the reforms he proposed, you know, Putin also showed signs of responsiveness, if you like. So he said, we will change things, the age limit for women will be different. So I think it was the last resort. It was something that had worked in the past. And I think now it will be a question not just of, you know, changing blame orientations, but changing the agenda so that something else more important comes and reduces the salience or the visibility of the reforms. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Andrei?
I think that it could be a very simple answer to these new challenges. Selling threats, as it was, buying loyalty. This is also old instrument, but new tools for it, just like this social biased agenda for NGOs, gathering money and redistributing it through the state instruments, through budget. This is kind of a Putin's market, state-driven and state arranged. Nobody knows what are the possible future poison pills, as you named it, because nobody couldn't predict that Putin will suggest after the presidential election such a version of pension reform, this increase in the retirement age. It could be much safer to suggest to the society the returning to the previous version of the funded pension reform. They freeze this money, they spend it to the annexation of Crimea, I think. So why not to return to the normal pension reform instead of doing such sensitive things? And this story demonstrates that Kremlin can't decipher properly the people's demand. They really thought that increase in a retirement age couldn't be so painful for people. It was really so. But to be honest, personally, I didn't think about it in these terms, that it could be so sensitive for the society also. This is my fault as well, unknown fault.
Very interesting. Okay, I'd like to take actually just a group of questions, and then maybe our panelists can respond to the ones that are directed at them or the ones that they have interest in. So if you have a question, raise your hand. These two here.
Sorry, Martin Ribben. Katya, this is for you. In light of what Andrei's comments, particularly about the emphasis on foreign policy and that's influence, did you in the research test for foreign policy in terms of responses, or not really?
No. Great, thank you. Next one.
Thank you. Olena Nikolenko, Fordham University. I have a question for everybody about the core of protesters, those who participated in this pension reform protest. I'm curious how much it changed over time, whether it was economically disadvantaged pensioners who were most inclined to protest, or more recently better educated, with a high education, who were more aware what was going on and the far-reaching implications of this pension reform, who turned to the street. And I'm just also curious, you mentioned this train of changes, the volunteer movement that is now underway as a new project by the Kremlin. So I'm curious, how different is it really from the Nashi youth movement that also tried to tap into the positive energy and innovation of the young generation, and that project kind of died at some point, and now they're trying to bring it back in another format. So what is different about this one? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, let's take one more in the group. Yes, please, over there.
Hello, my name is Andrei. I'm a political scientist and author of a Russia-themed blog. There have been a lot of talk about surveys and different numbers, so I would just like to throw 3 more numbers in there and let the panel react. First of all, Levada survey from end of last year, according to which 55% of Russians held Putin responsible for Russia's economic problems. It just happened that the same number of Russians said that Putin was responsible for the country's economic successes. This might just mean that since there is no leader in Russia with the same level of political authority and decision-making autonomy as Putin, people just make him responsible for practically anything. Then a recent poll by FCIOM, state-run pollster, according to which Putin's trust rating was at 33.8% in January. This is the lowest number since 2005, which again may mean that Putin cannot play the savior of last resort as he has in the past couple of years in the Russian political system. And third, a study from last year, end of last year also, from Leontiy Bizov, according to which most of Russian citizens agreed that they could rally around an effective state that is able to deliver social justice, and that no other forms of mobilization would work. Mobilization by the state, for instance, that we've heard as an example. So my question is the system losing steam, or is it just the project Putin the Tsar? And if it is losing steam, is there an alternative that is visible that you can see emerging in the next couple of years? Thank you.
Yeah, great. And actually, let's take one more, just in case we don't get a chance for a second round. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica Pisano, New School for Social Research. I have a question for, I guess, Katya and Andrei. My question is, what is known in the survey research about gender differentiation in protest and pension reform, and what might that tell us about sort of how does that track with ideological work around traditional values and how women might be responding to this? Thanks.
Great. 4 questions. So let's go back to the panel and ask them to comment on the ones they find appealing. We'll start with Kristy again.
I think I'll actually cede my comments to the political scientists.
Okay. All right, fair enough. Some would question the wisdom of that, by the way, but that's okay. Yeah. Katya.
Yes, so there were a few questions about the protesters this time round, and I think that we still don't have as comprehensive data, public opinion data from this period that we had for the 2011-2012 protest to be able to answer this question with confidence and as much certainty as we can as political scientists. I think what was striking was to see a much broader socioeconomic coalition come together. That was not necessarily the case during the corruption protest. And the fact that the protests were so spread all across the country in rural settings even, I think it adds a different dynamic. But this is certainly a question to come back to. Now, foreign policy responses, of course, we have seen before, as with the case with the sanctions, that Russians have been very responsive. Support for the government increased at times of a threat, and also whether that's an external or internal threat. But as the other panelists have pointed, I think this is no longer the case. I think now Russia is looking inwards, and the picture that Russians are seeing is not very pleasant to them. Now, I don't know if there is an alternative. I'm not able to comment, but what I will say is that we know from, again, previous works that people being able to identify an alternative determines how they will respond to protest and whether they will defect from the ruling regime party. So people who are not able to identify an alternative, they're more when they're dissatisfied with the government, they're more likely to disengage. They're more likely to withdraw from politics. So that is absolutely crucial. And of course, many different ways of capturing trust or support for the president. All indicators are in decline. But again, I think the question is whether there's a trend or something to be reversed as it has happened. Thank you all for your.
Thank you, Andrei.
Yes, I can combine foreign policy question and the question about traditional values, because this is the same thing, because foreign policy, this is also traditional values, krepa, so to say, and the field of answers to some Western attacks or something. And this is really important until now. And traditional values here is kind of a imaginary moral code of law-abiding citizen here. It is really imaginary. This is a sphere of symbols, and people are living in absolutely another situation, and they divide real life and symbolic life. Again, in this life, Putin is also partly symbol, partly personality who is responsible for some unpopular steps. And there are 2 more very important points in this field, symbolic field. This is war. To some extent, until some time, this very approval rating of Putin and Medvedev, they depended on some military operations. And the first boost in Putin's and Medvedev's rating was in the year 2008, after the Georgian campaign. And then, Olympic Games of 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, and tremendously it was a spike in approval ratings. It was a substitution of war, and historical policy is also extremely important. Our future is in the past. We don't have any kind of goal, just like in communist time. We were going to the communism. It doesn't matter that instead of communism we have got Olympic Games in Moscow, but there was a goal. Right now we are talking about, not we, Putin is talking about breakthrough from what to what, the question is. This is a problem, and because of that the glue of nation is the history, Great Patriotic War, our victories, our achievements, space, I don't know, all that Soviet stuff in this sense. Alternative figures, ideas, I think no alternative ideas, no alternative figures. There are, here is a bunch of ideas how to modernize the system, but the current authorities, they will never accept it, they will never implement it. Pension protests, communists tried to use it, not so successfully. Navalny tried to use it, not so successfully, because this protest wasn't protests as we can assess it. People are going to the streets, upheavals, mutiny, something like that. It was simply discontent. I had a talk with my colleague Alexei Levinson from Levada Center. He said, I've never seen in my life such a curve in mood. This line, so then like this, and then going down in August. More substantive for people, I think, is 5 years of decline in real incomes. This is really serious. This is all about depression and moods, pessimism about the future, a very low level of consumer mood. It's even worse than it was in the beginning of the crisis, because in the beginning of the crisis, Putin said, in 2 years everything will be okay, and people believed in it. Right now they can't believe to any words. Train of changes versus Nashi. I think it's the difference between Surkov's way of behavior and Kirienko's way of political behavior. Because Train of Changes is a positive program. This is positive involvement of civil society. In Nashi, this is a negative program. This is destruction, and this is construction. So this is really could be quite efficient.
Yeah. Josh, do you have a final question you want to put in? Like, Yeah, we're short on time. We're gonna we can extend it out 5 more minutes, but I just want to make sure that we end on time, and we'll also go to Mark Yan.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I had a question for each of the panelists, but for Kristy, this question of nostalgia for the pensions, right? So I've written a book on communist era legacies, on attitudes in the post-communist era, including towards social welfare, and we absolutely found a strong legacy in social welfare. But what I'm really interested in, and from your perspective and the research you've done, if you have any insight into the extent to which the nostalgia is primarily being felt by people who lived through that period of time themselves and experienced the pensions, or if this is being transmitted to children, right? Is this something that's going to outlive this particular cohort? And then my other question was about the protests, the nature of the protests themselves. Katya, which was that I'm curious about, you're showing us this rising importance of economic protests. But one of the things we often heard, like from Graham Robinson's work earlier, about some of the protests that took place in the 2000s was that these were protests about particular, concerns about, like, bus money no longer being provided and things like that, but that they shouldn't be read into them as dissatisfaction with the regime. These are protests about particular policies that had particular policy goals. Having shown us this trend in the rise of these economic protests, can you tell us anything about whether economic protests, as opposed to other forms of protests, are likely to be, we should be interpreting these as more of a verdict on the regime, Or are we still in the world of these are just protests about specific policy issues, but they're not a particular verdict on the regime, as opposed to other types of protests, whatever it is that's in the other 40% of your data there. And I think I'll just leave it at that, given that we're short on time.
That's great. And Chris, just a comment to pick up on Josh. I study post-Soviet Central Asia, and one of the charts I always show the levels of inter-republic transfers and how Central Asia was really dependent upon Moscow for a lot of its budgets and subsidies. But I found your chart, just absolutely stunning, and that tells, I think, the other half of the story, right? The pension equalization across the republics. I mean, to think that someone in the Kyrgyz Republic is earning around about the same levels as in the Russian Federation, I think that also gets at some of the deep nostalgia that's felt about what the loss of the Soviet Union was felt. So thank you for that. That was really enlightening. So let's go back to the panel for the final responses to Josh, or any final thoughts it might have. And Kristy, we'll start with you.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question about nostalgia as being generational. I mean, honestly, my only evidence here is anecdotal from the people I talk to in my life. What I found a little bit striking back in the summer was how many of my younger Russian friends who are often a little bit politically indifferent, if I've had to generalize, were so irate by this. They were so incensed by this. So I think there is, a sentiment that, we're not ever going to have the same, we're not going to have the same sense of faith in the future. I mean, because fundamentally the problem is pensions are so connected to having a sense of momentum, as Andrei just mentioned. If you don't have that sense of momentum, the sense of what you're moving toward, it becomes a lot harder to rationalize your everyday, your living expenses going up, your real wages falling, all of the rest. And so I don't know to what extent it's generational, but I think in some ways, if you look at the pension reforms that had happened up until this point, there had been this kind of bifurcated attempt to put the older generation of people born before 1967 onto the old funded model and try to inculcate this new sense of a pension is something that I personally invest in. It's tied to market forces, but it hasn't been especially successful. And they went back on that recently, I think in 2013. So I think there hasn't been this sense that there hasn't been a lot of success in getting people to think about pensions really differently. And now a lot of people don't really have, a strong sense of what pension policy is going to mean for them. They just know that it's not going to be really great. Right? So that's definitely part of it. On the subject of the republics, this is a really good point. I mean, it really is tied. The graph that I showed there is very much about sort of old age pensions, urban pensioners. So of course you're going to have less money going out to people in other republics that have less urban workers in them. But there was this kind of equalization. And the logic, the way that it was talked about at the time, was very much like we are narrowing differences between these other republics and the metropole. We are narrowing differences over time between the countryside and the cities. So there was again this sense of kind of equalization that so seen as a real achievement, and that is something that I think explains some of the nostalgia as well.
Perfect. And Katya will give you the last word today to respond to Josh's question.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I think the socioeconomic protests and this agrees with Professor Robertson's work are very much issue specific, right? And that increased the fact that it did not translate into electoral or approval punishment for the regime was quite clear when we looked at the approval trends, right? The blame attribution graph points to a very similar picture, right? So people protest about increases in prices, wages, labor issues. That is not necessarily translated into punishment for the regime. Now, what is a different question, though, is whether economic deterioration, economic hardship should not be political, and economic voting tells us that it should at some point translate into punishment. It has translated into punishment up to now, but not for the executive, and I think that's a difference.
Great. Thank you all for a great discussion. I want to thank especially Kristy, and thanks so much again for your efforts and for being here today via Skype to share your research. I want to thank Katya, I want to thank Andrei, thank Yana, whose idea was this, thank Josh, and a reminder to everyone, Twitter and what's the exact topic we're doing? Russian trolls and Twitter, February 7th at NYU. We hope to see you there at 5:30. And thanks again for sharing your evening with us.